Talked about the advantages incumbents have. We have talked about midterm elections in general. We're now going to focus on some unique aspects of the House election. So we're going to be looking at reapportionment and redistricting, and we can see the impact that those have on states. And we can see with redistricting, we can see how that process can be taken advantage of for political gain. So let's start by refreshing ourselves on the House of Representatives. I know that you know that House of Representatives, the representation for each state is based on the population of that state. So states with larger populations have more votes than states with smaller populations. But populations change, right? The people must be represented equally. We will end up talking about a court case called Baker versus Carr, which is actually a Supreme Court case about Memphis. But the rule in that court case is one man, one vote. So, with the House of Representatives, it is incredibly important. The Constitution demands that the districts be of equal size. So that way the people are represented equally. Now, since people move and populations grow, the districts and the number of seats in each state have to be adjusted from time to time to make sure that people are represented fairly. So, the Constitution demands that the census be taken every 10 years. So the census that's in the Constitution is something that absolutely has to happen. So we conduct a census every 10 years in order to count the population. And the purpose of the census is not just to have an idea of the population, but the purpose of the census is so that we can ensure that the House of Representatives is representing Americans equally. So after each census, the House of Representatives has to be changed to adjust for the population changes that took place over the decade. We're going to go through two processes. One is reapportionment, the other is redistricting. All right, first, let's talk about reapportionment. So, after the census, we have to change the representation in the House of Representatives. We have to make sure that the people of each state are represented fairly in Congress. That's what the 14th Amendment is all about, equal protection under the law. So the people of each state must be treated equally. That means we have to look at the total population of each state. We have to look at the number of seats in the House of Representatives, and we have to make sure that they are divided fairly. So this process is called reapportionment. And reapportionment means that we are going to move seats in the House of Representatives from one state to another state based on population changes. Okay, there are 435 seats in the House. That was a law passed about 100 years ago. They could change that number if they want to, but it doesn't seem like they're going to change that number. So after the census is taken, we have to figure out the population of each state, and some states will end up getting more representatives if their population is growing quickly, and other states will lose representatives if their population is shrinking. So the effects of reapportionment is very, very important to states because states can get more representatives, and that means more votes in the House of Representatives. That means they have more of a say in the policies. They have more votes in order to support interests that are important to their state. And you also know that that's not the only thing that the number of congressmen adds up to. So this reapportionment also helps determine, it does determine how many electoral votes each state will have. So the process of reapportionment is important for both the legislative branch and the executive branch. It makes a state more important in the House of Representatives. It makes a state more important in the Electoral College. Let's take a look at what this means. So we're going to come up with a real goofy example here of how reapportionment would work. The number of seats in the House of Representatives is based on the state's population. Tennessee is a pretty large state. Tennessee is more than twice as big as Arkansas, and it is more than twice as big as Mississippi. In fact, the number of people per representative across the country is roughly 750,000 people for each member of Congress. Now, some states don't have that many people, and the smallest amount you can get is one. Other states will be a little underrepresented because the small states are a little overrepresented. But in this case, we know Tennessee is more than twice as big as Arkansas. It's more than twice as big as Mississippi. Tennessee has 9 representatives, 9 districts. Arkansas and Mississippi each have 4. So let's talk about what would happen between now and the 2030 census if people made a terrible, terrible choice and moved away from lovely Tennessee into Mississippi and Arkansas. So let's imagine this scenario together. Now in Nashville, let's say that the Titans move away to London because Nashville is a super lame place. Nobody wants to hang out in Nashville. So the Titans leave. Nobody wants to be there without a football team. So all these people are going to move away from Nashville. And then my worst case scenario, what if when the Grizzlies lease is up in 2025, the Grizzlies decide to move to Seattle? And that will mean there's nothing left for us here in Memphis. We'll be so depressed without our beloved Grizzlies, so people might move away to Tennessee and Arkansas. So when the census is done in 2030, what if we count and find out that 1.5 million people have moved away from Tennessee? What would happen in this scenario if they moved to Mississippi and Arkansas? In this case, Tennessee would have too many representatives. The people of Tennessee would be unfairly overrepresented, and the people of Mississippi and Arkansas would be unfairly underrepresented. They have way too big a population to have only 4 representatives. So after the census is completed in the year 2030, the seats will be redistributed for the election in the year 2032. So in our case where people moved away from Memphis or moved away from Tennessee into Arkansas and Mississippi, then in this case, Tennessee would lose 2 representatives and it would therefore lose 2 electoral votes. Mississippi and Arkansas would each gain a representative. So they would gain electoral votes as well. Mississippi and Arkansas would be more important than they were in the House and in the Electoral College, and Tennessee would be a little less important than they were in that House and than they were in the Electoral College. And I would be very, very sad because we wouldn't have the Grizzlies anymore. So reapportionment happens every census year. So every year on the zero. In the year 2000, this was the result of reapportionment. You can see that some states, especially states in the Midwest, were losing population. And this doesn't mean that they are actually smaller than they used to be, but they are growing very, very slowly compared to the states in the gray and the states in the blue. But the fastest growing states would be Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Those states were growing very quickly. So they, after the 2000 census, they each gained 2 representatives and electoral votes. California, Nevada, Colorado, and North Carolina all got 1 as well. So those states got more votes in the House, became more important in the Electoral College. Here's the reapportionment that took place after the 2010 census. So this is one, you see the same pattern here, right? The states in the Midwest are losing population, or they're not growing very fast. The states that are growing continue. In this case, Texas grew by 4 seats. So Texas is growing very quickly. Florida continuing to grow quickly. Georgia, Arizona continuing to grow. So those are the states that gained population rapidly. This is one I like to talk about because it gives a good example of my adopted second home down in Louisiana. Now, between the year 2000 and the year 2010, we had a great tragedy in Louisiana. There was Hurricane Katrina. And that came in 2005, and it destroyed the city of New Orleans. And the whole city had to be evacuated. And many, many, many people, thousands, tens and thousands of people, were not ever able to move back. And so Louisiana lost a lot of population between the year 2000 and the year 2010 because of Hurricane Katrina. Many of those people, especially the people in New Orleans, they evacuated to Houston, and many of them stayed in Houston for good. And so that shows us how real events actually cause reapportionment to happen. In this case, a hurricane destroys the biggest city in Louisiana. People had to evacuate. They went to the next closest very big city, which is Houston, Texas. And you can see that Louisiana lost a seat and Texas gained one because of that population change. So this is important to states. It helps, helps them get voices in the House, voices in the Electoral College as well. The 2020 census is currently underway. We won't get the final results of the census for a while as they process all that data. But based on trends that we've been tracking, this is the projection the projection of what is likely to happen for the 2022 election. So, based on the census, I see the same patterns that I saw in 2000 and in 2010. States in the Midwest, that's Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Illinois, New York. Those states are likely to lose representatives based on their population growth. They're growing slowly or they are shrinking, while states in the South, in what we call the Sun Belt, continue to grow quickly. So Texas, Arizona, Florida, those were states we've seen on the last two maps as gaining seats. California, Colorado, Virginia, and North Carolina may be gaining seats. So we see a lot of population movement here, and this is reflected in the reapportionment of seats. It makes states more important over time in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. All right, so that is the process of reapportionment. Remember, reapportionment means we are moving representatives from one state to another state. So this is like states competing against each other based on population growth, and they're competing for influence in the House. They're competing for influence in the Electoral College. So this is a very, very important process to states. This is why the census is so important. The states really, really care about an accurate census. The states really want to make sure that every person in their state gets counted. That way they can have the highest population compared to the states around them, and potentially gain influence in the House or gain influence in the Electoral College. So now we're going to look at a process that is even more complicated and can be taken advantage of, but is related and also based on the census, and we're going to look at redistricting.